Picture this, a rusted, forgotten shape sitting under a dust-covered tarp in the back corner of a barn in rural Ohio, untouched for almost 50 years. The family who owned it had no idea what it actually was. They almost sold it for scrap metal. And when an appraiser finally pulled that tarp off, he didn't just find an old car. He found a check for over $2 million. That is the reality of American automotive history in the 1960s. A decade so wild, so reckless, and so obsessed with speed that ordinary factories accidentally built some of the rarest, most valuable machines the world has ever seen. Today, we're counting down the American cars from the 1960s that were once just cars in a showroom and are now worth an absolute fortune, and I promise you, the very last one on this list is going to leave your jaw on the floor, because the number attached to it is almost impossible to believe. So stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to look at old American steel in a completely different way. Let's start with a car that almost nobody outside of muscle car circles has ever heard of, and that's exactly why it's worth so much today. The 1969 Yenko Camaro. In the late 1960s, General Motors had an internal rule that no engine bigger than 400 cubic inches could be installed in a Camaro. It was supposed to protect insurance rates and keep things civilized, but a Chevrolet dealer named Don Yenko had absolutely no interest in civilized, using a loophole in General Motors' special ordering system. Yenko found a way to stuff a massive 427 cubic inch V8 into the Camaro's engine bay, an engine that was never supposed to exist in that car. The result was a machine that could destroy nearly anything else on the road in 1969, wrapped in the body of what looked like an ordinary pony car. Dealers weren't exactly lining up to sell something this extreme, and buyers weren't exactly lining up to pay for it either. Fewer than 200 of these were ever built, and today, finding one with its original numbers matching engine is like finding a needle in a haystack. A genuine Yenko Camaro now regularly sells for well over $300,000, with the most pristine documented examples pushing past $500,000. A car that once sat quietly on a dealer lot because nobody wanted to pay extra for the engine is now one of the most sought-after muscle cars in the entire hobby. But if you think a forgotten dealer special is impressive, wait until you hear what Chrysler was doing on the racetrack, because this next car wasn't even legal for the street when it was first built. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, this car looks like something out of a science fiction movie, and that's not an accident. Chrysler engineers were obsessed with one single goal: breaking 200 miles per hour on NASCAR superspeedways. To do that, they gave the Charger a nose cone that stretched nearly 2 feet longer than a standard model, and bolted a towering rear wing onto the trunk that looked almost cartoonishly oversized. Fans hated the way it looked. Competitors were terrified of what it could do. NASCAR rules required Chrysler to build a certain number of street versions just to make the car legal for racing, which meant everyday customers could technically walk into a dealership and drive home in a rolling wind tunnel experiment. Almost nobody did. The Daytona was strange, expensive, and impractical for daily life, and it sat on lots gathering dust while buyers chose more conventional muscle cars instead. Fewer than 500 of these were ever built for public sale. Today, that awkward, unloved wind tunnel experiment is one of the crown jewels of American muscle car collecting. A well-documented Daytona, in strong condition, now trades for well over $400,000. And the most desirable examples, especially those with the largest Hemi engine option, have crossed the $1 million mark at auction. The car nobody wanted in 1969 is now a car that collectors fight over in bidding wars. Because the next car on this list wasn't just unwanted when new, it might be the single most valuable muscle car convertible ever produced. The 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. In 1970, Plymouth offered its legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi engine in the Barracuda, one of the most feared engines of the entire muscle car era. An engine so powerful and so expensive to ensure that most buyers simply avoided it. Now imagine combining that terrifying engine with a convertible body style, something that added even more cost and complexity to an already expensive car. The math simply didn't work for most buyers. In 1970, insurance companies were charging astronomical premiums for high-horsepower convertibles, gas prices were about to spike, and the muscle car era itself was quietly dying. As a result, Plymouth built a shockingly small number of Hemi Cuda convertibles that year, and depending on which sources you trust, the number sits somewhere between just 9 and 14 genuine examples, with some estimates going even lower for certain color and transmission combinations. Think about that for a second. Fewer surviving examples than you have fingers on both hands. This car went from being a financial mistake that dealers struggled to move off their lots to becoming a mythical unicorn in the collector car world. In 2021, a 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible sold at auction for nearly $3.5 million, and the 1970 examples are considered even more desirable by serious collectors. We are talking about a car that essentially nobody wanted new, now valued in the same league as a private jet. Alright, before we go any further, I want to know what you think. If you had to choose one car from this list so far to actually own and drive, would it be the sneaky insurance-dodging Yenko Camaro, the alien-looking Dodge Daytona, or the terrifyingly rare Hemi Cuda convertible? Drop your answer in the comments, because honestly, I go back and forth on this one every single time. And trust me, we are just getting started, because the next car on this list was built purely to satisfy a technicality, and that technicality accidentally created a legend. The 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. Ford desperately wanted to compete in NASCAR with a brand new high-performance engine called the Boss 429, but NASCAR had a strict rule. If you wanted to race an engine, you had to sell a certain number of cars powered by that exact engine to the general public first. There was just one massive problem. The Boss 429 engine was physically too large to fit inside a standard Mustang's engine bay without serious modification. Ford's solution was almost absurd. They shipped unfinished Mustangs to an outside contractor called Car Craft, where workers had to completely reconstruct the front suspension and widen the engine compartment by hand just to cram this enormous engine inside. Every single Boss 429 built required this bizarre, labor-intensive conversion process, all just so Ford could legally race the engine on Sundays. Customers who bought these cars in 1969 weren't necessarily getting the fastest Mustang money could buy in a straight line, but they were getting one of the rarest, most mechanically fascinating muscle cars ever created. Essentially a race engine wearing a disguise. Only about 859 of these were built for the entire model year. Today, a genuine numbers matching Boss 429 routinely sells for well over $200,000. And exceptional documented examples have pushed toward and even beyond the $400,000 mark. A car that existed purely to satisfy a paperwork loophole is now one of the most respected and valuable Mustangs Ford has ever produced. But before we move on, there's one more insurance nightmare you absolutely need to hear about, because this next car single-handedly convinced entire insurance companies to raise their rates on an entire category of vehicles. The 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air IV. Pontiac had already built a reputation with the original GTO for essentially inventing the muscle car category. But by 1969, competition was heating up fast, and Pontiac's engineers needed something more extreme to keep bragging rights. Enter the Ram Air IV, a specially tuned 400 cubic inch V8 featuring aluminum intake components, a more aggressive camshaft, and round port cylinder heads that were nearly identical to what Pontiac was quietly developing for its factory race programs. Officially, Pontiac rated this engine at a suspiciously conservative 370 horsepower, a number that almost nobody in the automotive press actually believed at the time. And independent dyno testing over the following decades has strongly suggested the real figure was considerably higher. The Ram Air IV package was expensive, difficult to order correctly, and required buyers to specifically request an obscure option code that most dealers barely understood, let alone recommended to walk-in customers. As a result, shockingly few GTOs left the factory with this exact combination of the top performance engine paired with the flashy Judge appearance package. Some estimates place genuine, documented Ram Air 5 Judge convertibles at fewer than 20 surviving examples worldwide, making them almost impossibly difficult to track down today. When one of these rare combinations does surface, whether at a major collector auction or through a private sale, the numbers are staggering, with confirmed transactions pushing well past the $500,000 mark, and the rarest documented convertibles, occasionally clearing seven figures entirely. A car that dealers struggled to even properly order in 1969 because the paperwork was too confusing is now one of the most obsessively hunted muscle cars among serious Pontiac collectors anywhere in the world. Now, stick with me, because if you thought engine swaps and paperwork loopholes were wild, wait until you hear about a car that Chevrolet built almost entirely in secret, using a budget that officially did not exist. The 1963 Chevrolet Corvette Grand Sport, in the early 1960s, General Motors had an official corporate policy banning direct involvement in motorsport. On paper, Chevrolet was not supposed to be building race cars at all. But legendary Corvette engineer Zora Arkus Duntov believed the Corvette needed to prove itself against European sports cars like the Shelby Cobra, and he wasn't willing to let a corporate memo stop him. Working largely under the radar, Duntov and his team began developing a lightweight, purpose-built racing version of the Corvette, using a thinner fiberglass body, a tube-frame chassis, and a massive big block engine that had no business fitting into a Corvette at the time. The plan was to build 125 examples to satisfy racing homologation rules. But before the project could go any further, General Motors executives discovered what was happening and shut the entire program down almost overnight. By the time the axe fell, only 5 Grand Sports had actually been completed. 5, not 500, not 50. 5 cars built in near secrecy, using a budget that officially never existed, before the entire project was killed by corporate politics. Those 5 cars scattered into private hands and became some of the most legendary and mysterious machines in Corvette history. Today, when a Grand Sport occasionally changes hands, and it almost never does, the values are simply staggering, with informed estimates placing these cars well into the tens of millions of dollars each, making them arguably some of the most valuable American cars ever built. Period. Okay, I need you to stay with me here, because we are entering the final stretch of this list, and these last few cars are going to make everything we've talked about so far look almost ordinary by comparison. If you're new here, now would be a great time to hit that subscribe button, because we cover stories like this multiple times a week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Let's talk about the 1970 Plymouth Superbird. This is essentially the street-legal sibling of the Dodge Daytona we discussed earlier. But if anything, it wore its aerodynamic insanity even more proudly. Built to help Plymouth compete against Ford in NASCAR, the Superbird featured that same absurdly long, pointed nose cone and towering rear wing, engineered purely to slice through the air, at speeds most street cars of the era could never dream of reaching. But here's the part that makes this car's story almost unbelievable. When these cars first arrived at dealerships, the public reaction was overwhelmingly negative. People thought the styling was ridiculous, almost embarrassing to be seen driving. Some dealers reportedly resorted to removing the massive wing just to make the cars sellable, or offered them at steep discounts simply to clear inventory off their lots. Plymouth built nearly 2,000 of these for the 1970 model year, hoping to meet racing homologation requirements, and a significant number of them sat unsold for months, sometimes years, quietly depreciating in dealer lots across the country. Fast forward to today, and that same car people once found embarrassing is now one of the most iconic and valuable muscle cars in American history. Pristine, well-documented Superbirds regularly sell for well over $300,000, and the rarest engine and color combinations have soared past the $1 million threshold at major auctions. Imagine being a dealer in 1971. Practically begging customers to take a Superbird off your hands for a discount, having no idea that exact car would one day be worth more than most houses in America. Now, here's a story that proves even the people who built these legendary cars didn't always understand what they had. The 1966 Shelby Cobra 427 Super Snake. Carroll Shelby was already a legend by the mid-1960s for stuffing enormous engines into lightweight British roadster bodies, creating some of the most brutal, uncompromising sports cars America had ever produced. But even by Shelby standards, the Super Snake was something else entirely. Built using 2 massive superchargers stacked onto an already powerful 427 cubic inch Vate, this modification pushed output to a genuinely terrifying level for a car, this small and this light, with a chassis that offered almost no electronic assistance whatsoever between the driver and disaster. Shelby originally built these as a way to test just how far the Cobra platform could realistically be pushed. According to the most widely repeated version of this story, only 2 Super Snakes were ever built. One was reportedly sold to a customer who found it too intense to live with and returned it almost immediately. Carroll Shelby himself apparently kept the other one for his personal use for a period of time. 2 cars. That's the entire production run of one of the most powerful and terrifying machines America built in the entire decade. When a genuine, documented Super Snake occasionally surfaces at auction, and this happens incredibly rarely, the results are jaw-dropping, with one confirmed example selling for well over $5 million. making it one of the single most valuable American cars from the entire 1960s to ever cross an auction block. All right, deep breath, because we have finally arrived at the car that ties this entire list together, the machine that represents the absolute peak of what 1960s American engineering, obsession, and pure reckless ambition could produce. If you've made it this far, you already know this is going to be worth the wait. The 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. On the surface, this looked like just another Corvette sitting on a dealer's lot, wearing the same body as every other Corvette that year. Chevrolet, however, deliberately buried this car's true capabilities in confusing paperwork and misleading official specifications, because they didn't actually want ordinary customers buying it. The L88 package included a race-bred 427 cubic inch V8 that Chevrolet officially and dishonestly rated at just 430 horsepower, when independent testing and racing results made it clear the true output was significantly higher, likely well over 500 horsepower in a car that weighed barely over 3,000 pounds. Chevrolet intentionally discouraged casual buyers by requiring the removal of comfort features like air conditioning, a radio, and even a heater, while demanding a minimum 11:1 compression ratio that required specialized racing fuel most gas stations didn't even carry. This wasn't a car built for cruising boulevards. It was a race car wearing a thin disguise of civilian registration paperwork, and Chevrolet made it deliberately unpleasant to own so that only the most serious, dedicated buyers would even consider it. As a result, only 20 official L88 Corvettes were built for the 1967 model year. 20 cars, intentionally hidden from the general public, built almost as an afterthought for a tiny handful of buyers who understood exactly what they were getting into. Today, that deliberately obscure, deliberately uncomfortable racing machine is considered the single most valuable production Corvette Chevrolet has ever built. Documented, numbers matching 1967, L88 Corvettes have sold at auction for well over $3 million, with the finest known examples pushing toward and even past the $5 million mark, making a car Chevrolet actively tried to discourage people from buying one of the most explosive investments in automotive history. So there you have it. Cars that dealers couldn't give away, engines that existed purely to satisfy paperwork technicalities, secret projects killed by corporate politics, and machines so intense that even their own creators found them almost impossible to live with. Every single one of these was, at some point, considered a commercial failure, an oddity, or simply too extreme for the average American buyer. And every single one of them is now worth an absolute fortune, in some cases more than most people will earn in their entire lifetime. That's the strange, beautiful irony of automotive history. The cars nobody wanted often become the cars everybody wants decades later, once the rest of the world finally catches up to how special they really were. Think about the family with that barn find we talked about at the very beginning of this video. For nearly 50 years, that machine sat under a dusty tarp, completely forgotten, worth essentially nothing but scrap value in the eyes of the people who owned it. Nobody was polishing it. Nobody was insuring it. Nobody even remembered exactly what it was capable of. And yet, the entire time, hidden under decades of dust and neglect, sat a fortune waiting patiently to be rediscovered. That's honestly the most fascinating part of this entire hobby. Somewhere out there right now, in a garage, a barn, or a storage unit that hasn't been opened in years, there could be another one of these forgotten legends just waiting for someone to pull back the tarp. Now I want to hear from you. Out of everything we covered today, which one of these cars would you want sitting in your garage if money truly was no object? The sneaky insurance-beating Yenko Camaro, the alien-inspired Daytona, the terrifyingly rare Hemi Cuda Convertible, the secretly built Grand Sport, the embarrassing Superbird nobody wanted, the two-of-a-kind Super Snake, or the deliberately hidden L88 Corvette? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're releasing new deep dives into the most valuable, most fascinating cars in automotive history, multiple times every single week. And trust me, based on everything you just heard, you do not want to miss what we're covering next.